Thank you. Good evening.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Mr. McDonough, Chairman, would you introduce your board and
Sure, Mr.
give us a
Chairman.
rundown here, please?
First of all, good evening, Mr. Chairman, members of the board, Mr. Carroll, Mrs. Gesso, and Mrs. Mulvihill. My members of the board, on my left, we have Mr. Robert Thornton. On my right, Mr. James Grover. On a personal note, I'd like to acknowledge the many years of dedicated service that John Carroll has given to this town, as well as his assistance over the years for the Board of Assessors. I've had the privilege to work alongside John for 34 of his 39 years in many capacities, and I just wanted to personally thank John and wish him a long and healthy retirement. The board is here this evening to give you options regarding a fiscal year 18 tax rate. As in past years, all of our commercial, residential, as well as our personal property values have been reviewed by our outside vendors for submittal to the Massachusetts Department of Revenue. The package that was submitted to you this evening, or the other day, has the detailed information to support the new assessed values. In addition, the board has prepared a PowerPoint presentation to highlight and summarize and support the hundreds of figures that are in that package. By and large, most single-family residential properties saw an increase in assessed value of approximately 4%. Condominium and multifamily properties saw a slightly larger increase. Commercial property values were reviewed and adjusted on a case-by-case basis, resulting in very few changes in the commercial values. It's important to note that the new assessed values are based upon sales of properties that sold in calendar year 2016, as well as evidence from income and expense data and new growth in our personal properties. So if I could direct your attention to slide 1 on the PowerPoint. Slide 1 is an overview of basically why we're here tonight and how we accomplished setting the tax rate. We take the total tax levy that's needed to be raised, and we divide it by the value of all our properties. The result is the new tax rate. On slide 2, it explains how we arrive at our annual tax levy. The blue line is a result of the statutory 2.5% increase, while the yellow line indicates new growth. And it's important to note the consistency over the past few years. Slide 3, and I just want to go back to slide 2 for a second, just to show you that the 2.5% in property tax increase and the 1.8% result in a total increase in the levy of approximately 4.3%. That's going to be important to remember later on in the slideshow. So if we could now go to slide 3. Slide 3 demonstrates the historic annual tax increase for the past several years. Once again, the operative word here is consistency. Last fiscal year, there were several new properties that came on the books for the first time, such as 2 new car dealerships, Herb Chambers, as well as the apartment complex at Upland Woods, which was partially complete, and the Benchmark assisted living, which is also partially complete. This year, we saw the completion of both Upland Woods at 100% and the Benchmark assisted living. This combined with 32 condominiums, which were brand new, mostly down at Endicott Woods, as well as reviewing all the building permits. That's how we arrived at the increase in the levy. The next slide, slide 4, is a historic review of Norwood's total residential values. This includes single-family, condominiums, and multifamily properties. While single-family values have grown at approximately 4%, the total residential values, including condominiums and multifamilies, has increased by 7%. Again, it's important to stress these are consistent numbers from year to year. And it's also very important to note that while some people will see a 4% increase, some values will have a greater and some will have a lower value. And that's based upon location as well as market-driven sales within certain areas of the town and on certain styles of properties. If we go to slide 5, you'll see it's a history of the single-family home values. Once again, the operative word, consistent growth. We are seeing increases that are fairly stable at 5%, 5%, and 4%. Again, you're not seeing any roller coaster up and down. Slide 6 is a historical graph of Norwood's commercial values. It shows a mostly consistent growth from approximately $1.28 billion in value in 2013 until this year with a 3% change in value to roughly $1.44 billion in value. Going to slide 7, this slide is perhaps the most telling. We have, we have demonstrated that we had consistency in both the tax levy and in value. The result is a tax rate history that also is very consistent for the past several years. Going to slide 8, this shows where Norwood stands among surrounding properties with residential tax bill. This is due in large part to our high commercial tax base. Now, some may say that we should raise taxes because our residential rate is so low. The next few slides will demonstrate that we are taxing at the maximum allowed by the Massachusetts Department of Revenue. Moving on to slide 9 is our fiscal year 18 levy limit.
No.
I'm sorry.
You're on the commercial industrial.
On commercial industrial, okay.
Right.
Slide 9?
This one here.
Okay. Yep. Okay, the slide shows why our residential rates are so low. The fact that we have a large commercial and industrial base allows for the town to shift a larger percentage to our commercial and industrial base, which is established under Mass General Laws, Chapter 58, Section 1A. Next slide.
So levy ceiling.
Slide 9 is our levy limit, fiscal year 18 levy limit as dictated by the Department of Revenue. In small print, you can see that the maximum allowable levy for this year is $72,947,027. That is the figure we have submitted to the Department of Revenue to help you set the tax rate this evening. In other words, we are taxing at the most that is allowed. Next slide. This is just a little background so that you can see the historical shift over the past several years that the board has chosen to shift from residential to commercial properties. Slides in 11, I'm sorry, next slide.
Yeah.
And it's, once again, just important to note that it's been very consistent as far as the values, as far as the levy limit, what we have been doing all these years. Slides 11 and 12, and we'll show them one after another, are the end result of all the previous pages. We have discussed the new growth, we've discussed the levy, and now it's time for the board to choose a new shift rate. The options are before you, and these two slides will show the impact on both the residential and the commercial properties. Tax bills and the estimated increases on average a shift upon those properties. At this point, I'll ask if my board members have anything they'd like to add or point out that I may have missed. Otherwise, we will open it up to the board for discussion.
I'm
Mr.
very
Grover.
comfortable with what we have.
It's also important to note, if we go back to the earlier part of the presentation where I mentioned the shift in new growth, that 4.3% figure, the reason we have the 56% shift highlighted is because that translates to approximately 4.2% shift, which is consistent, once again, with what the board has done in previous years as far as the overall estimated increase in single-family values.
The only thing I would add, Mr. Chairman, is that going back to the very first slide that Tim showed tonight, it just shows the simple equation that you use tonight we're talking about setting a tax rate, and it gets into, the components of it. That's just a mathematical formula, and, so the thing that jumped out at me in looking at this package this year is that the three components of it, tax levy, the values, and the rates, each one of those components could not be more consistent in the changes from year to year. That's the thing that jumps out at me. Like the levy. The levy has been increasing at very consistent rates. And it's been what's been allowed by the Prop 2.5 law plus what we've gotten for new growth. And you see those numbers are very consistent. So that's the numerator. The numerator is going up on a consistent basis. The denominator, the levy, the values, same thing. That's what Mr. McDonough said. So in both the numerator and denominator, the levy's going up consistently, and the values are going up consistently now for the past couple of years. The resultant quotient, or the rate, same thing. You look at one of those last slides that Tim showed, it shows that the rate history here in Node, either residential or commercial, has been kind of the epitome of consistency. So in government, I think from sitting where you gentlemen are sitting, that's a very important thing to be able to say to people, is that the town has been kind of a model of consistency here with, the levy, the values, and the rates. So it kind of ties the whole thing together, and I think Tim said it very well.
Thank you. I was going to interrupt you, but I didn't want to.
Sure.
The slide when you showed the 45% paid
The options?
no, by business, commercial.
Correct, yep.
It's important, I think, for the public to know that their total value, property value, is only 26%. And yet they're paying 45% of the tax burden. So they really do, as you did mention, help us out significantly in what we're going to have to pay in our local property taxes.
That's correct, Mr. Chairman. I probably glossed over that a little too quick, but the percentage of the levy that's paid by the commercial industrial is much higher than pretty much every one of our surrounding towns, at 45%. So we're asking them to pick up a much bigger burden, which translates to a much lower residential tax bill, which is why our rates are so low compared to surrounding towns. But we also have a much higher percentage of commercial properties that we can shift this burden to. However, the board has kind of been consistent, as Mr. Thornton said, in how we treat. We want to be good neighbors. We want to be good, obviously take care of the taxpayers, but also, the residential taxpayers, but also be cognizant of the additional burden it may put on commercial and industrial property values. Correct.
The other point I wanted to make, and I know everybody in this room knows that, but not necessarily all the public watching, while we're deciding what the tax rate's going to be, which will affect the tax burden that we're going to be paying, that's based on action all of us and town meeting at our request have approved in the spring. We're not deciding how to spend, what the amount of money will be spent tonight. That's already been decided. We're now just deciding who's going to pay what, the residents, the commercial, how that's going to be shared or spread. And I have a slightly different view, which I think is relatively consistent, but with the levelness of that you've been stressing tonight. I like the shift of 1.57 And my reasoning for that is it actually lowers the residential tax rate from the current by 6 cents. And it reduces or increases the commercial by only 1 cent. So we're trying, again, every year we keep an eye on the business we want, or the commercial side. We want to get as much from them as we can to help the residential without burdening them too much, without pushing them out of town. We want to make sure, no, it's still the place they want to do business. And I think that that number is a good, fair number for both residential and commercial, and in actual dollars, kind of out of our pocket, the amount that we had to increase our taxes, again, for this residential, an average person that we keep looking at and mentioning, and very few of us are actually that individual. All our properties are going to differ slightly, but that's what we have to go on to make comparisons to, and for people to be able to visualize. When we look at that average family home, if we go to the 1.57, the actual out-of-pocket dollars will be perhaps $10 less than what the increase was last year, when we include everything that's going to affect them this year. And the commercial is going to be approximately $800 increase. And I just think it's fairly consistent. I think it's very fair. And while we can't avoid people having an increase because their property values are going up, cost of operations have gone up, we're keeping it level. We're keeping it as consistent as we can from year to year. And I think that otherwise we have to put a little bigger shift on the businesses. And I'd rather not do that. This year we put a little more on them in past years, and we can't keep doing that every year. When we have the opportunity, we have to give a little leeway, so that we might have to shift it again towards them next year, depending on how things work out. So that's just my preference. Any questions or comments by the other board members? Mr. Bishop?
Basically, I feel exactly the same way. One of the things I've always looked for, yes, we do have an obligation to take care of the residential taxpayers, but I want to watch that tipping point on the commercial too. I don't want it so much the other way that people will think twice about coming to Norwood. That does not seem to be the case. They seem to be still coming anyway. And I think everything that my colleague here to my right has purported is absolutely correct. You know, I think a 1.57 is more than fair to everybody across the board. We still keep the commercial where we want them without tipping them too far, and we're still good to the taxpayers residentially here.
Mr. Howard?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't disagree. I'd just like to make a point, if I could, that as has been brought out to me a bunch of times by individual property owners, and that is the following, that yes, we take pleasure in saying that Norwood is the lowest tax rate around. That's all well and good, but to an individual property owner, all they care is, how much is my taxes going up? That's what the people care, and I think that's rightly so. But in the same tone, if we're going to provide X amount of services to our town, then those have to be paid for. And of course, the majority of the expenses nowadays, of course, salaries, and that's not too much of a variable on the salaries. That if you're going to do these things, you have to pay the people to do those things. And my only other point is that in saying that the residential rate might change a little bit downward, that doesn't necessarily on an individual property translate to a lower tax bill. That's a very important point that is our chairman of the assessors, Mr. McDonough, said so well, that it depends on your individual property as compared to the sales, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So very important point that for, you know, otherwise there might be 500 calls as soon as the bills go out to Mr. McDonough saying, how come my taxes didn't go down? You said they were going to go down, you know. But just to explain that a little bit, if I could. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I think it's a great presentation to all three of you. Good job. I think the underscoring the point about the consistency over time is important here too. So trying to balance the burden on businesses with the burden on residential taxpayers is important. We managed to maintain that equilibrium, I think, such that businesses tend to stay here. When they do come, they tend to stay. And when they can find, and businesses from outside tend to want to come here and take up available space. So I think it's a point well made and point well taken about the consistency over time. That's probably more important than rates and numbers and dollars and so forth, you know.
Mr. Chairman, just to try to clarify something, so one of the things that came up, there was a little discussion about, you know, the rates and so forth. You know, I know Mr. McDonough mentioned this previously, I'm not sure about tonight, but, you know, essentially the assessor's role here is not to recommend a rate. It's Chapter 58, Section 1A of the laws stipulates that it's the Board of Selectmen that has to go through that. We can't recommend a rate. It might have been implied that we were doing so, but I don't know if Brian can hear this, but if you throw up slide number 12 for 1 second, if you can, if not, basically, yeah, there it is. Just to kind of focus on Mr. Plasko's point, I think it's a good one. This thing here, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Plasko, but what you were suggesting is maybe, we were just highlighting up above where it says 56%. Here's what the numbers would be if you kept the same CIP shift percentage in yellow. Not to say that was our recommendation. That's the point I'm trying to get at. And what you were suggesting, I think, Mr. Chairman, was if you went to 57%, the increase over in the right-hand column there, underneath the $195 in yellow, would be $169 per year. And last year, it was $215. So the difference is, it's actually a smaller increase by $46 a year, and you were probably factoring in the CPA possibly.
I was, and I was careful not to say that because I don't want to confuse people, and I might have done that by trying not to. I might have outsmarted myself by not being clear enough that that is a decrease, as you are now pointing out.
Right.
And I said it would be only
$10.
$10 out of pocket.
And I saw what you were doing, right.
Considering that out of pocket, we now have to pay the CPA.
But when you factor that into the equation, that's kind of my point, and I think you were doing that subconsciously, is that even when you factor that in, and that's not part of the tax levy, it's a surcharge separately voted by the voters, you're still down $10 a year on the total, and then the rate is dropping down by 6 cents? It's going from 11...
6 cents, I think it is.
6 cents?
An estimate, yep.
So that's, I think, where you were going, and I just wanted to try to, thank you, Brian. So that's all I was getting at.
It is, and thank you for pointing out that the tax levy decrease itself is greater than the $10 I mentioned.
Right.
I was talking total out of pocket that the average person was going to have to pay out.
So it's still consistent, as Mr. Malone was saying. It's overall still consistent, but it's actually, it's better than it had been the year before.
Thank you for pointing that out, clarifying that. This is a public hearing. Is anybody else here to be heard on this matter? Seeing none?
Mr. Chair,
yes,
motion we close the hearing.
Second.
All in favor?
All right.
Opposed? Unanimous? Wish of the board?
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, Mr. Bishop.
I'd like to make a motion that we go with the 1.57% number.
Yes. Okay.
I'll second that.
Anything further? All in favor?
All right.
Opposed? Unanimous. Thank you for the information. Thank you for your
Chairman,
efforts.
thank you.
The public presentation, very, very good and clear. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I do have extra packages